going to a wedding or a bar mitzvah today because otherwise they were surprised that I had a coat on. So another great first moment in 2 years for me. The topic of our presentation is ESG, entitled The Signal and the Noise. We've interpreted that to mean we'll have a fairly broad-based discussion about trends in ESG, covering private companies and public companies. We have a fantastic panel that covers that whole spectrum from the formation decision for a company through going public and beyond. With me is, in the order of that journey of that company from formation on, Jolynn Vallejo, who's the Chief of Staff at Kapor Capital, which is and Jolynn will say more about this, but is a venture fund that has had a social impact thesis long before almost any other private fund did, and has watched as the landscape has come to them in many ways in the last decade and beyond. And we have Greg Elders, who's a managing director at Joele Frank, the communications and PR advisory firm. He's also a former senior ESG analyst at JP Morgan. And to my left, Melinda Haag, who's a partner at Weiss and the former US attorney for the Northern District of California, focused in large part on government investigations, regulatory compliance matters, and really the person who saves all of our clients once they're public and haven't yet caught up with the trends on ESG matters and other regulatory matters. So we're going to focus our conversation in large part on a hypothetical company that is forming, growing, raising capital, approaching an IPO, going public, and existing as a public company. That'll be kind of the through line of the conversation. I can't promise that everything will stick to that arc and that narrative, but that's how we've sort of organized ourselves. And because I'm doing sort of double duty as a moderator and a panelist, I'll ask myself the first question, which is to talk about the trends around companies as they form, which I think is one of the most fascinating elements of the whole ESG conversation, because it's a leading indicator of what the public markets are going to look like and what regulatory scrutiny how it may evolve over the next few years. So, and some of this is very top of mind for me. We represent Allbirds that just went public last week. We formed them in 2016, converted them to a public benefit corporation in Delaware in 2017, and in the context of their IPO, spent a lot of time on ESG-related disclosure, and associated with that, standing up an independent advisory council called the Sustainable Principles and Objectives Advisory Council that's intended to create something of a guideline for future companies that as they grow and access the capital markets. So really trying to balance governance and related disclosure with, as a reflection of the company's deep-seated views around sustainability was a key part of that whole journey. So back to the leading indicator around the formation moment. So I would say as of maybe 5 years ago, I probably represented 1 or 2 PBCs, public benefit corporations, or I should say 1 or 2 companies that were anything but a regular C corporation. I probably now represent 20. And it's not because I'm going out and hunting for PBCs, it's because that's just part of the conversation now when we're forming companies. It's one thing that's been very heartening about that is it's not just companies where sustainability is at the very focus of their mission and what they're trying to do as a business. It's enterprise SaaS companies that feel like they need to be serving constituents beyond just their stakeholders. It's a couple of other semi-quantitative metrics. We also have seen, as of maybe 2 years ago, there was, I think, 1 PBC that was public, Laureate Education, which has been public for a long time. Now I think it's up to maybe 10. And that's almost all of that is in the last 12 months. And that is, as we're checking the box on trends here, you're keeping score at home, that's definitely a trend that I think is gonna continue. Three things that are pushing that, and then we'll move on past formation to the sort of financing part of the equation. Number one, and I think most importantly, is something of a generational shift in the workforce, where increasingly people who are coming to work don't want to check their personal morals and beliefs at the door. They want to work at a place that they know is aligned with them. And a company having a very strong sustainability message is something that's increasingly attractive to today's workforce. That is then coupled with a really incredibly competitive market for talent, where companies are realizing that they can distinguish themselves from others by being a public benefit corporation, or if not, being at least very forward with their sustainability mission and their what we would call stakeholder capitalism. They don't really call it that yet when they're startup companies. And then third, and this is a good segue to a conversation about financings, we are absolutely seeing a trend away from being a PBC or being a social impact focused or sustainability focused company as a detriment or an anchor on financing and on attracting financing. And that's a trend that's continuing. It's not, that stigma is not entirely washed away, but it's moving in that direction. So that's a great segue to talk with Jolynn about, first I think about Kapor's mission and focus, which I think is fascinating and something that is what was surprising to me to learn when I first learned about it a long time ago. And I'd love to have you start by talking about that, then we can get into what the financing world looks like now for sustainability-focused companies.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jolynn Vallejo. I'm Chief of Staff at Kapor Capital. For those of you that don't know Kapor, we were early investors in Uber, Twilio, Asana, and some other software solutions. After 2011, Kapor made a commitment to invest in companies that are tech-driven, but are closing gaps of access and opportunities for otherwise marginalized communities and or communities of color. Now, this is important because in the venture world, usually we're looking at very high-growth startups. We're not looking at impact, and we're looking at almost scale without consequence. Kapor really wanted to disrupt that. And when this mission was set forth, there was a lot of pushback thinking that this would be at the expense of financial returns. In 2019, Kapor was able to do a deep dive from the investment period of 2011 all the way up to 2019 and looked at there's actually 3x in investment returns that they were able to get, which is in the top percentile of both PitchBook and Cambridge, for those of you that are in the sort of investment world. And it really sort of broke this myth that if you're investing in underrepresented founders or investing in solutions to help marginalized communities, that you can't have venture-like returns. So this is huge and very much spot on with what Peter's talking about, this new trend. And so since then, and in the latest 3 to 4 years, there's been an emergence of a number of funds, some smaller in size, 50 million to 100 million, but that are looking at investing in underrepresented founders, investing in solutions that have somewhat of an impact thesis. And sometimes they don't hit all those ESG goals. It might just be environment, or it might just be something that's a social solution. But in general, we're seeing that this is possible. And the consumer trend has also been educated to an extent where they want to invest or be a consumer for products that have some kind of social good. And I think Athleta being a B Corp is a great example. Many females out there want to feel empowered in their workout clothes, and Athleta being a B Corp has proven that they can have great quality clothing, but also positive returns.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd be interested in what you're seeing in your co-investors and syndicates around companies that are, or funds that do not have any particular stated purposeful ESG mission, but are nonetheless investing in companies. One quick anecdote, I represent a bunch of investors. The first time an investor client represented or invested in in this case it was before PBCs were a thing, in the first B Corp, they were actually terrified about the fact that the company as a B Corp was going to have to become a PBC once Delaware enacted its constituency statute to enable public benefit corporations to be a thing, and actually wrote into the charter documents of that company that once the constituency statute was passed in Delaware, that they wouldn't convert into a PBC because of this same fear that that the company would be turning into a nonprofit or something like that. And that's a thing that I largely don't see anymore. It's a little bit of a false positive because you don't see the investors that are not in the mix with PBCs because they're not in the mix in the first place. It's not like they're about to invest and then stop investing. But what do you see in syndicates where you're involved with non-mission focused investment groups?
Yeah, can you hear me better with this microphone now?
That is
okay.
better.
Well, it's great because co-investors are actually coming to us because we've already taken a lead in this space. So anything that's health tech, ed tech, helping otherwise marginalized students that haven't really had a great experience K through 12, creating solutions for that, creating solutions in fintech that disrupt, predatory lending or financial inclusion. I think the interesting piece here is that these are very also profitable spaces to be in. The amount of people that are underbanked, not just in the US, but in the world alone is huge. And so we, as Kapor, are taking a lead in that space early on before any of this was quote unquote popular or perhaps in social media, has really given us a position so that co-investors come to us and say, we want to learn more. How do we do this? How do we create a space for our companies in our portfolio as well to be mindful of impact, even if they're not necessarily impact driven or if we don't have an impact thesis? But one thing to note that I think is important, and it's detailed very nicely in a book called Differences That Make a Difference by Jorge Tintinger, which was the first Latino CEO here in the United States. In his book, he talks about and shows with data from McKinsey and other organizations that having an inclusive and diverse, not just board, but also just staff, can really increase the bottom line. It isn't just about the right thing to do as humans, it's actually positive for returns. So what we've done at Kapor is create something called a founder's commitment. And in this founder's commitment, we will not invest in the company unless the founding team agrees to do 4 things, which is a GIVE acronym. GIVE have goals of diversity and inclusion on boards and in staff. Invest in technology solutions that remove bias in the hiring process. There's a number of studies that show how bias really stops folks from non-top tier schools and last names that are perhaps not represented as typical in getting into a tech pipeline. And then the GIVE, G-I-V-E, we want to also volunteer and give employees time to volunteer for underrepresented communities or the communities that they serve with their product, and E, educate. So I think with that, a lot of co-investors come and say, well, how are you helping your portfolio companies really reach these goals? And as they prepare in that trajectory of becoming a B round, then C, and then hopefully IPOing or having a large exit, that's when measurement of ESG goals really comes into place. So starting early with the company and educating them and getting them to set the culture when they're still small is what really leads them to success. And a great example is Twilio, if anyone ever wants to look at them.
Awesome. We'll come back to a couple of those things later. So now our hypothetical company, Cooley has formed the company and Kapor has invested in it. And now it is a couple of years prior to an IPO. And it now needs to make this interesting transition from talking about ESG things and sustainability in the context of wooing potential employees and talking to commercial partners, and focus that effort now on what that looks like from a disclosure perspective as it's talking to investors about that, and otherwise getting ready to mature and be for a foray into the public market. So Greg, this is where you come in, and so our hypothetical company has hired you and Joele Frank to talk to them about it. Love to just get you to use that as a jumping off point and talk about what you're typically seeing in those engagements.
Yeah, so investors expect companies to have an ESG story, to be able to engage in terms of understanding their risks, the opportunities, and really sort of how their business can take advantage of these key ESG sustainability trends. So at Joele Frank, we've refined basically a 3-step process in terms of what companies need to do to demonstrate that they're responding to ESG issues. And sort of from the tactical, the first step is understanding what do the big ESG raters that investment companies use, what do they expect that company to report on? So MSCI, Sustainalytics, these are the big raters that investors are highly dependent on. And everyone hates them. Companies hate them, investors hate them, but they're really the gateway for it. So the first step is, what should you be reporting on? So, identify those issues and start addressing them. 2, what do the major investors want? So BlackRock, largest asset manager, has come out and said, companies should articulate how they're going to align with a net zero world. And not only have they said it, this year they voted against 250 directors at companies who aren't doing enough. And so it's mostly starting with the oil and gas type companies. So if you're a tech company, it's probably not your turn yet. But also it's a lot easier, right? A lot of tech companies have come out and talked about their net zero goals. So it's helping understand things like net zero. State Street has come out big on diversity, right? Expecting companies to disclose their EEO1 employee diversity data, talking about goals. What are they going to do, not just the board level, but further down the company to promote diversity. There's different sustainability frameworks. And really that third piece, that real opportunity, is to sort of really think strategically of what is the ESG sustainability megatrends that your company can tap into. What is the business growth drivers? So it's not just so much we are managing our risk, but what is the opportunities? Because specifically there's a lot of money, something like $4 trillion in ESG dedicated mutual funds and ETFs. And so what we've seen with the clients that can really do this right is they can take, something like an average company with average ESG ratings will have something like 0.5% of their shares held by ESG funds. If they do it right, they can tap into both the passive ESG funds as well as the active ESG funds. See something like 2-3% more of their share base held by ESG funds. And so this is generally new money. It's long-term, it's sticky, it'll keep voting for directors as long as the company's doing things right. So there's a real opportunity to tap into that, and as it grows. So in the US, something like 1.5% of ETFs mutual funds are ESG. In Europe, it's something like 15%. And so that direction, we're starting to see that, obviously not just in Europe, but here slowly starting to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I come at this from a particular perspective of representing private companies that are accumulating debt in basically every area other than ones that are directly revenue generating. How do you sort of convince a still private, although aspirational company to be investing as much time and energy as they need to in these kinds of efforts? Is it that they'll have more access to more capital once they're public? Are there horror stories you tell them about companies that fail to be sufficiently focused on this?
I think honestly, I don't have to do much sales work. So oftentimes we have a lot of private equity clients. They have their portfolio companies, and they say, we want to take this company public. We want to get our sort of house in order. What should we do? And so if the big investor says you have to do this sustainability stuff, it makes it a much easier conversation. You have to talk to Greg. And so, and I think it's just gotten to that point where everybody understands what needs to be done. And obviously sort of how far companies are willing to go will vary, but a lot of basic things are just understanding your carbon footprint, understanding the diversity of your company is easy to do. Obviously becomes harder when actually what are you going to do about it? If you have all dudes, whatever, running a company, it becomes a bit more of a challenge to start changing things. But that's the kind of thing where, when Goldman Sachs says they're not going to take a company public unless there's some diversity, again, it's a much easier conversation.
Yeah, we'll get back to the culture part in a minute. So now our company is in the IPO process or maybe has gone public, and now the rubber hits the road where now there's an incredible amount of scrutiny from stockholders and regulators and otherwise. Kind of a perfunctory question, but are the regulators paying attention, and what do those trends look like?
The short answer is yes. And I feel like kind of the buzzkill because all of this is wonderful and progressive and forward thinking and exactly where we should be headed as a country in these important areas. And then the regulators come in. And suddenly, there's an overlay of seriousness over these kinds of pronouncements. And it is interesting listening to you two together talk about this because these are obviously issues that have been important to companies and investors and employees for a long time. And if a regulator was sitting here listening to this, if they hadn't already, they would be paying attention, because obviously these are issues that are important to investors. Investors are making those investment decisions based on representations that are made by companies, and that's exactly where the regulators come in. I would say that the regulators have been behind. I served as the U.S. Attorney during the Obama administration, and we weren't talking about ESG at the time. I suspect behind the doors of the Department of Justice, although they haven't made any big public pronouncements, that they're talking about it. Certainly the SEC and other regulators are talking about it, and the White House is obviously talking about it. So I want to just tick off a few examples of things. So the regulators have woken up. If they were not paying attention before, and they were softly paying attention to before, but they have really woken up in earnest, certainly in the last year, and starting with the White House. In May of 2021, President Biden issued an executive order relating to climate-related financial risk, and it calls on regulators to consider the need to enhance climate-related disclosures, talking to the regulators directly. It applies specifically to the SEC, the FTC, the CFTC, CFPB, and the Federal Reserve. And it really calls upon the federal agencies to wake up and pay attention. So it started with the White House. The SEC has been the leader, I think, among the federal regulators, obviously, and they've issued all kinds of initiatives and pronouncements in the last months, and certainly in this year. I think maybe my mic went out, but oh, it's back. It's back. Starting in March of 2021, the SEC issued its 2021 examination priorities, which really amplifies ESG and climate-related risk in particular. They announced the formation of a task force within the enforcement division to focus on what they say is ESG-related misconduct. So there's an assumption in the pronouncements of the regulators that there has been or will be misconduct. That's just the way they look at the world. We look at, you all are talking about it in such a favorable and positive way. Regulators are more cynical. And so they talk about it in terms of proactively identifying ESG-related misconduct. And it also, forming the task force, they also said that the first step is to identify gaps or misstatements in the disclosure of climate risks under existing rules. So if there wasn't certainty that the regulators were paying attention, and not only paying attention, but looking for misconduct, it certainly is something that people should be paying attention to. And these pronouncements are almost coming down on a monthly basis. In April of 2021, there was an SEC risk alert focusing on internal control weaknesses. And they're talking about examining firms to evaluate whether they're accurately disclosing their ESG investing approaches. So again, it's a cynical perspective. It's an assumption that people are saying things related to ESG that they're not actually doing. That's the SEC's sort of focus. And then a couple of months later, in July of 2021, SEC Chairman Gary Gensler, it's back. Whenever I say it's out, it's back. The SEC Chairman Gary Gensler gave a speech and talked about this, among other things. And he noted that the SEC actually issued guidance in 2010. So as I said, there's sort of soft attention, but I think they're really amping it up. So he referred to that guidance, and then he talked about 2021 and said by the end of the year, he talked about the fact that investors want clear rules, companies want clear rules, and he said and pronounced that the SEC is going to deliver and develop and deliver clear rules by the end of the year. He talked about considering whether to include disclosures and specific rules around disclosures in 10Ks, so they're considering that. He talked about the fact that the information needs to be helpful in investment decisions. It can't be boilerplate or just sort of aspirational. He wants people to focus on it being actually helpful to investors. And he talked about the fact that the SEC should consider whether they should require the disclosure of the underlying data in connection with the statements made by the companies, like that there's green, sustainable, things like that there should actually be disclosure of the information and data that underlies claims like that. It hasn't happened yet, but he's promised it by the end of the year. And they're really focusing on pretty robust disclosures. So and the SEC is the leader. They're not the only ones that are paying attention. The OCC has issued some pronouncements with respect to ESG, as have foreign regulators. So everyone's getting on the bandwagon. DOJ, as I said, has not said anything specifically groundbreaking yet, but I will tell you that as formerly working for DOJ is particularly competitive with the SEC. Doesn't like the SEC to get way ahead on really any issue. This obviously sort of fits more within the SEC's mission, but DOJ, I think, will look for ways to play a role in this as well. They work very, very closely with SEC, and especially, I think, in the Biden administration. It was something in the Obama administration that I served that was very important to the administration, that the SEC and DOJ work really closely together, and I suspect that relationship is rekindling during the Biden administration. So I'll pause there, but I'm kind of a buzzkill. Sorry.
Just to jump in, like one can have a positive story that is factually correct. That's generally what we try to do at Joele Frank. And I think the other piece is it's not just regulators, but investors too are getting smarter. So companies can't just say like sunshine, happiness, sustainability. Like there has to be something to back it up. And yeah, a lot of our clients are getting scared of what's the SEC going to do. Again, particularly the oil and gas, those kind of companies where clearly climate change is a risk, how they're talking about it. So yeah, so they all have to come together to make sure investors don't get annoyed and regulators don't get annoyed.
And Greg, can you actually say a little bit more about, in that context, about the current, most commonly used reporting regimes that are the ones that are being scrutinized? I think just a sort of factual information about what currently people are subjecting themselves to.
Yeah, I mean, so there really are no rules. Companies can do what they want, but investors have really told companies you have to use SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standards Board guidelines, and TCFD, Task Force Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So there are two voluntary guidelines, and yeah, so investors expect companies to sort of to use them. And again, BlackRock, State Street, biggest investors are saying if you're not going to do it, potentially going to vote against directors. And right now, companies can basically do whatever, as long as they're doing something, but that's going to change in time, where investors are going to expect more. I think there's a question, are the regulators actually going to really expect this to be done right? And because SASB has been set up around sort of what are material sustainability factors, obviously materiality has regulatory meetings and stuff like that. So there's a question, how's that all going to converge?
Excellent. And shifting gears a little bit, going back, Jolynn, to one thing that you mentioned around building habits early on in companies. I think a lot of people see culture and culture-related issues that start early on with companies can really have an outsized impact when the companies get larger and when they get public. Can you say more about the kinds of things that you do and focus on with your portfolio companies?
Yeah, I think we're really lucky to have both Mitch and Frida Kapor Klein be mentors in this space, and their experience, Mitch dating back to Lotus 123, early tech boom, right, Silicon Valley giant, and really speaks to how important it is to start early, because the culture of a company really comes from its CEO down to its core founders. And then that gets expressed and trickles down, and when you have rapid growth, that can be lost. And it's really the employees that kind of go rogue, even if the CEO is trying to set a certain example. But if the CEO hasn't given thought to set example, then the employees really go rogue, and you can have, anti-Asian American sentiment during COVID, like we saw in some tech companies, as well as some other foul behaviors. So setting that culture early on is important. And there's also a great quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have the greatest strategy and move forward with the planning and processes, but if your culture is not in place, and if you have employees that are really competitive with each other instead of collaborative, it just all goes out the window. So some of the things we do at Kapor, to answer your question more specifically, is we invest in culture. And we have a head of talent that works with our 140 plus active companies and conducts trainings on how to create a positive company culture, conducts trainings on how to recruit diverse talent, but not just have that diverse talent come, how to really make them feel included, so that belonging piece. There's diversity and inclusion, but there's also belonging. It doesn't matter if you come from a Latin American background and you're in a mostly white setting. If you don't feel included, then you're not going to speak up. You're not going to contribute your great ideas to move, your division forward. So we put money where our mouth is. We invest in what we call POT technologies, which is people ops technology, which again removes bias in the hiring process. And then we also put money towards programming. And if necessary, we will set up mentors with our companies when an intervention is needed. When there is rapid growth, like I mentioned, things can really spiral out of control. And then that's when either Mitch or Frida or in our close network can come and be part of an advisory board, as we saw with Uber, for example. They were really instrumental in getting on board and cleaning up some issues that really come from CEO down, but also with rapid growth.
How do you, I forget which technology company biography this was about, but they were talking about how culture was effectively set by the time they had some very small number of people, 15 or 20 people. Do you see that sometimes if you get involved later stage that you have a harder time making change?
Getting involved later stage is difficult because the culture has already been set, and reversing that can take years. So that's why there is this desire and our founders' commitment to start early. So all of our companies have to adhere to that commitment. And if they don't, we will stop investing in follow-on rounds. Or if it's a really extreme case, there have been 1 or 2 situations where we've sold stock in the company. We just don't want to be involved in it. And it's not just our money that's important. It's our network. It's the way we support companies. It's the connections we make for sales and sort of lighthouse customers. So for us to remove ourselves, it's a big deal. But to get to the point of what happens later, when you're large and you're trying to set that change, a lot of people need to be either cleaned out or have a mentality change. And that can be quite difficult when you're running operations day to day and you need to keep, the sales going and customer success.
Greg, do you see that in your engagements? As you come in later stage and you're trying to get people ready to be particularly focused on governance and disclosure, that there are some commonalities based on the culture that's already set when you walk in the door?
I mean, I think I'm not sure how much is already set, because I think a lot of times we'll come in and advise companies, what do they need to do to address these issues. And I think sometimes we'll say, the board of directors, public company, not public company, are new to ESG issues, and they have to sort of get up to speed in terms of what's expected, how to talk about it, that when you have engagement meetings with BlackRock, State Street, other investors, they're going to ask questions, not only on corporate governance, executive pay, which we've been doing for a while, but now really sort of every asset manager is supposed to ask like 1 or 2 questions at least on ESG. So be able to talk about what the company's doing on the environment, on diversity, that kind of stuff. And that's often a new topic for most directors.
Yeah. Melinda, the culture question to you in the context of regulatory red flags, what are some of the things you're seeing there?
Yeah, sure. So when the regulators are looking at the industry, looking at the business community, they obviously have limited resources, and they do tend to focus on particular companies, and they do have red flags. They have things that they look for, and it's probably not going to be too surprising, but they do look at culture. If a company has a good reputation, it's not likely going to get the attention of the regulators in the same way that a company that doesn't have a good reputation might get the attention of the regulators. Regulators are going to look at tone at the top. So when the leader of a company it makes pronouncements, public pronouncements that are incendiary or controversial, it does get the attention of the regulators. There's a downside to being completely frank as the leader of a company or one of the leaders of a company. The regulators are human, they read the papers, and they do focus on companies as a result of what they read in the papers. They look at litigation. So if litigation has been filed against the company, they do pay attention. They have a regular practice of monitoring litigation filings to see what's out there. They are looking at whistleblower complaints. They're looking at other regulatory agencies. So if a company has an issue with one regulatory agency, the others will look at the same time to see if there are issues that might present to them. And that goes for ESG as well as anything. So if a company has an issue with respect to financial disclosures, that may very well lead the regulators to look to see if there are other issues, such as ESG or other things. One thing to be conscious of is the department and the SEC and other regulators are increasingly looking at data analytics. There's so much out there. They have such limited resources, and they are using data analytics to try to figure out what companies they should focus on. So I would not be surprised if it doesn't sort of if it doesn't come up in the ESG context as well. FinCEN collects financial information. That's how the regulators decide who to focus on with respect to financial issues, and there will be issues here as well. There was a recent speech by Lisa Monaco at the Department of Justice. She's the Deputy Attorney General, the second in command of the Department of Justice, and it was in October, at the end of October, and it was sort of laying out the priorities of the Department of Justice in the near term. And one, notably, she said, we're going to pay more attention to corporate crime. I think in the prior administration, there was a shift back to immigration, gun crimes, crimes of violence, and it's not that those things won't be addressed, but she did renew the focus on corporate crime in general, and then she talked about 3 new actions that the department is going to take. And one thing she said was that they're going to issue new guidance to prosecutors that historical misconduct must be considered when deciding corporate resolutions. They're directed to consider full criminal, civil, and regulatory record of a company when deciding the appropriate resolution. So really a focus on, we're not going to look at the immediate issue before us. The Department of Justice is going to look at all of the issues that the company has faced. So you've got to pay attention to and be concerned about any negative attention on the company, whether it's litigation, whether it's a whistleblower, whether it's negative press, another regulatory action. All of it is going to be considered by the Department of Justice. That same concept is present in the Department of Justice principles of federal prosecution of corporations. There are principles that guide decisions about prosecuting corporations, and in those principles, there is that same concept of priors that the Department of Justice looks at, whether there were other prior incidents, whether they're related to the instant conduct or they're related to some other conduct that's concerning to regulators. So it all sort of piles on. So, companies just need to avoid issues really in all contexts, because it really can lead to significant problems going forward. And I will just say that with respect to disclosures, I think what the regulators are going to look at really specifically is pressure testing. So if companies are making representations about anything, whether it's financial issues or now ESG issues, the regulators are really going to look to see whether the companies are pressure testing. Are the companies aware, is compliance, risk, and legal working together to understand what statements are being made? Because these statements can come from all kinds of different parts of the organization. So I think the regulators are going to be looking to see whether companies are on top of it. Do they have risk, compliance, and legal, looking at all the statements that are being made, looking at what the data is underlying those statements, whether companies are living up to commitments, forward-looking commitments that they're making. The regulators are really going to look for that.
It's my perception of many of the regulators, particularly during COVID, is that they're leanly staffed and have too many things to do. And so is it a fair takeaway from what you said that it must be a continuingly, increasingly high enforcement priority to be looking for ESG-related issues?
That's right. And perhaps unfortunate reality is there is this sort of shiny new toy aspect to it, even though it's not a shiny new toy for most of the people in this room. It's a somewhat shiny new toy for the regulators. And so, it's just, again, sort of human nature that it's just something that rises to the top of their pile, and especially with the sort of competitiveness that does exist between regulatory agencies. If the SEC, for example, is really taking a leadership role, that will cause the other regulators to want to step up to the plate as well. They don't want to be left behind if they feel that they do have some jurisdiction over the issue.
All right. So we have 4 minutes left, so we're going to move to our lightning round. Get ready. One trend or issue that you think is not going away or is going to be increasingly important in the coming year or two? I'll go last in case we run out of time. 1 minute each. Jolynn.
I think the biggest issue right now in venture capital is that we see new funds that are addressing some of these systemic issues on underrepresented founders not getting enough venture capital. But however, even though there's more money out there in the ecosystem, the percentage of money going to underrepresented founders is still less than 2%. And that's a hard thing to break because everyone has been hearing that there are new funds and more money's going, but the total amount of money being spent is still not leveling out. So hopefully this is a trend that we can break, but it's been a trend that it's existed for a long time.
Great.
I think picking up the theme of sort of really showing your work and demonstrating any sustainability claim is for real. And I think separate from the regulator piece, which is coming down, is that investors are getting more sophisticated. So investors are under pressure to do more ESG, like BlackRock, State Street, all those kind of people, they have to show they care about it so that they can win new money. And so as they do more, they're getting more sophisticated, pushing it down on companies. So it's a matter of telling that story. And the other piece is the investors are scared too, right? A couple months ago, the Wall Street Journal had an article that DWS, the asset management arm of Deutsche Bank, where the head of ESG there came out and said, the numbers in our annual report that like most of our money is aligned with ESG is smoke and mirrors, which got the attention of both the DOJ and the SEC. So obviously they're making friends there, and that scares investors. Investors have to do more homework. Are coming down, so it's all that really companies are going to have to prove their ESG stories for real.
I agree. I do think that's the trend, and we've already really been talking about, I think, what the trend is, and I think it is companies will move much more toward really organized, sophisticated efforts to pressure test, to make sure that all the statement that they're aware, the company is aware of all the statements that are being made, and that there is data underlying those statements in case anybody ever asks. What supports what you're saying? And I do think the regulators will just keep coming. It's a monthly pronouncement at this stage. That's kind of the pace, and I would expect that pace to continue. There have been investigations by the SEC to date, and I just think they will continue. And I think Gary Gensler was very sober and not subtle in his speech in July, and they will issue the guidance that he's talking about. And since he suggested that it be that it be pretty comprehensive and pretty robust, I would expect them to issue guidance that is very consistent with what he was talking about. So I just think, and he'll do it by the end of the year.
Yeah, great. Thank you. My one thing is an extension of that. One interesting element of one of the pronouncements that Chairman Gensler made was that they were going to be looking for ways to monitor ESG-related disclosures in private companies. And thinking there was a hint dropped about maybe through Form D filings that are made with the SEC and the like, which then prompted, I think it was a bunch of Republicans in the House to write a letter saying, you didn't really mean that, right? Like you didn't mean you're going to do that with private companies, right? And so we have this sort of the battle being formed around that, and a lot of companies that might sneak up on next year. So there we have it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.